Thank you and welcome everyone. I want to thank you for joining us here at Price Worldwide Global Media Studio and welcome you what I think is going to be a particularly timely and thought-provoking discussion, and especially in light of the approaching midterms. I'm joined today by Elizabeth Currid-Halkett, a person I consider one of the most original thinkers at the university. Her research focuses on the arts and culture and the American consumer economy. Most recently, she's turned her attention to the role of culture in geographic and class divides. And in fact, her next book will deal with this subject, which we're eagerly anticipating. And her understanding of American culture really runs counter to so much of what we hear today in the media and elsewhere. And this is especially relevant, as I said, because people are voting right now and making decisions about our future. And not to give any of her findings away, but I think it also gives us quite a bit of hope that America is not destined to unravel along ideological lines. But Elizabeth is the James Irvine Chair in Urban and Regional Planning, and she's a professor of public policy and management at the USC Price School. She's also a member of the World Economic Forum's Industry Strategy Officers. Her previous book, The Sum of All Things, argues that the leisure class has been replaced by a new elite that is defined not by conspicuous consumption, but by more subtle things, such as the Pilates studio they visit. I myself have never been to a Pilates studio.
We'll do a quiz if you're part of the
It's readily apparent that I have not. But it's this new class that's reproducing wealth and riding the elevator of upward mobility as the less privileged are left on the ground floor. So Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us today. You're a geographer and a planner by trade. So how did you end up starting to look at overlooked Americans?
Thank you, Dana. It's great to be here. So I, as a planner and geographer, I'm always thinking about place. Whatever socioeconomics, cultural phenomena we are observing, they happen somewhere. And I'm fascinated by their unevenness, the fact that they're different in different places. We talk about cities broadly, but cities couldn't be more different from one another. And both empirically and personally, this issue of rural America was interesting to me. I was born in West Virginia, and my parents at a very young age, we moved quick hop to Pittsburgh and then to rural Pennsylvania, which is where I spent my childhood. Population 4,000, was Democratic until it turned Republican with McCain. And when Trump won the White House, and I was sitting around dinner tables in Los Angeles where everyone was saying, can you believe this? I mean, how did that happen? And, I was reading articles in the New Yorker about, rural America's reckoning. And I thought, I don't think that's what's going on, actually. I mean, I grew up in this place, and I think there's more to the story. And so as someone who was already interested in why things happened where they did, I was particularly interested in how is a place that I really know, which is rural America, what's really going on there. So I just decided to talk to people in the same way that I've talked to artists and, gallery owners and Hollywood folks. And, for my last book, people who ran small boutiques in elite cities. I did the same thing with people who lived in Appalachia and in Pennsylvania and Texas, wherever. And I wanted to hear their story.
And, what you mentioned, you talk a lot about urban and rural America. One of the things I learned from reading your book is that doesn't give us the granularity we need to talk about problems. I am a health economist, so I study health behaviors, and even within, and you make this point in your book in a different way, within LA County, for example, if you look at the rates of childhood obesity, something we've been talking about, in Santa Monica, where I live, it's about 6%, but in Bell Gardens, it's 33%. Wow. Yeah. And Could you talk a little bit about what you learned when you compared places like Appalachia and the Northeast and what you call the Deep South?
Yeah, totally. So one thing, when you get in there and you look at census data and Bureau of Labor Statistics data, you realize immediately that talking about urban and rural divides is just like, it's a total misnomer. You can talk about regional divides. So you can say, broadly speaking, the Northeast is doing much better than the South. And the South continues to be economically depressed and has been for decades. In fact, to the point that when you remove the South from a socioeconomic analysis, you see that urban and rural poverty levels are the same. So it just shows you how much, and that is a big issue, I think, for policymakers, developers, planners, like the more bespoke approach towards how we deal with these issues. So one thing I really found was that it was much more regional, that you saw that the Midwest is actually doing pretty well, and Midwest cities are doing pretty well, and so are Midwest rural towns. Same thing for the Northeast, same thing for Massachusetts, if you look like that. But the other thing that's pretty interesting to me is that if you look at cities, that you see, they are of course much more unequal than rural America. That wasn't always the case. In 1990, it was the other way around. But what you see is that, the wealth of a place like San Francisco obfuscates the fact that there is a lot of poverty. So when we talk about rural America being poor, it's like there are a lot of folks in these cities that are struggling too. And these blanket statements and aggregate data really hides some of these important points and actually hides the ways in which we can resolve them.
Yeah. And, you mentioned the Midwest, and one of the things you point out in the book that I found fascinating also is, we have Angus Deaton, who's a faculty member here at the Price School. He and Professor Ann Case have written several books now on deaths of despair. And a lot of that you point out is certain regions like Appalachia have been really hard hit by the opioid epidemic, but also in areas like the Midwest, the rural areas, it's much less frequent and prevalent, and the incidence is different. And so again, it gets at this granularity issue.
I was shocked. Because we have this mythology that rural America has just been destroyed by opioid addiction. And when you look at the CDC data, what you see is there is this handful of states that have been really destroyed, and everywhere else. The Midwest has rates lower than California. So, it shows you that this narrative, again, it impacts our interventions too. If we blanket statement things, we can't help the places that actually need help.
Right. So it's very important that you drill down and look at and San Francisco, there's a housing crisis. So you mentioned, for example, the poverty level and rates of poverty, but poverty is very different and quality of life is different. Did the people that you were talking to, how important is material well-being and consumption to the way they think about whether they're living a happy existence?
That is a wonderful question, Dana. Not at all. The thing that struck me so deeply in talking to folks in rural America was almost all of them had less than people I know in urban America. And yet they seemed so much more content. Their view of the world was not material. One of my respondents who I interacted with a lot, she lives in a trailer in the middle of Appalachia. She does not have a lot of money. And yet, you wouldn't even think about money talking to her. It just wasn't a part of her worldview for it to matter. That really resonated and was time and time again something that came, its absence is what was shocking, you know?
And actually, I think if it's the person I'm thinking of in the book, she said something like, if I made more money, I wouldn't be able to have basically the sense of purpose that she had. She knew exactly how much she needed in order to survive.
That's
what
right.
the sources were.
Yeah, $216 a week.
And your math was excellent. She was adding up the sources, and you did it. So we know you can sum, not just from the sum of all things, but from this book as well.
That's right. Basic arithmetic.
Yeah, exactly. So you passed basic arithmetic.
Thank you, Dana.
Which is not enough to get into the Price School, I want to add. You need a little more than that. So, I want to quote something from your book, which is, the problem is not that we are different, but rather that we fail to recognize how similar we still are. How do we go about better recognizing our similarities? Because right now, it feels like we're quite divided. And talk about what those similarities are, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so this was something that became clear to me almost immediately. I mean, I did these interviews in the heart of the pandemic. I did them by phone because no one was going anywhere, which turned out to be a real strength of my work because there was no judgment. Like, even our implicit bias that we're not even aware of. Like, I just got on the phone with someone and I didn't know what they looked like. And frankly, I often didn't know if they were Republican and Democrat until halfway through a conversation where I might ask them. It just was really extraordinary to me. So the thing that really struck out to me was that if we ignore whether someone listens to NPR or watches Fox News, or whether they're skeptical of Biden's results, or whether they are a diehard progressive, people care about the same stuff. I mean, we care about our families. We care about holidays where we can be with our friends and families. We care about, for the most part, many of us, a higher being, whether we call it evangelical Christianity or spirituality. We care about being good people. I mean, there's not a person who I spoke to who that didn't come out. And I think if we focus more on that, I actually think we really philosophically have it wrong. Like, we've prioritized this idea that what newspaper you read and who you vote for matters more than who you are as a human being. I mean, it's actually just, when you actually think about it, it's a totally insane way of looking at divides in this country. If you don't look at it like that, we're all people. And I don't mean to be hippie about it, but I actually think it's important to remind yourself that there's a lot of noise making us think we're different when we're not.
Right.
It
used to be taboo in the United States to talk about income at parties or how much people earn. That is, I know there's now a TikTok show where people are talking about how much they earn, but now it's taboo, it seems, to talk about political persuasion. People are very unwilling. So I want to come back to that, but I also want to ask you about one other thing, which is, there are many areas that you do a very nice analysis of different government data sources to make your point, like you were saying, about income. And we have this perception that rural America is poor, but that is indeed not the case, as you demonstrate. But the one area that does come out is the lack of education and the difference by education. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So when you look at many different measures of well-being, that rural America is doing really well. And I was very, very conservative. So I looked at places that were truly 5,000 people or less. So if you look at small towns, the numbers are even better. I have a whole, study of small towns, and they do even better than cities. So you've got home ownership, you've got median income is on average 10,000 less than cities. So if you control for cost of living, which that doesn't, it's actually, you're doing really well. But the two areas that you don't see this is health and education. And I don't need to go into health right now, but with education, they are remarkably less educated than urban America. And I've really debated a lot in my own mind the extent to which this matters. A lot of them seem happy. They're employed. Unemployment rates are actually lower in rural America than urban America. Their cost of living is cheaper. So from that measure, does it matter? But I think it matters because education and the cultural capital that goes with it is tied to our institutions of power. And it means that their voices just aren't heard. And for my book, I interviewed Raj Shetty, who many people will know as a very well-known economist at Harvard. He won a MacArthur Award. He's probably going to win a Nobel Prize. And I chatted with him on the phone for this book, and I brought up cultural capital, and I thought, bringing up cultural capital to an economist, this is going to be interesting. And he totally agreed with me. And he said, we think, social mobility, social capital is the greatest predictor of mobility. And of course, he's subsequently come out with these 2 papers in Nature, studying this on Facebook. And the conversation we had was, it wasn't that all of rural America needed to be in an Ivy League. In fact, less than 0.5% of Americans go to Ivy Leagues. And they're equivalent, like places like USC. But it was that some of them needed to, because they needed to be in the New York Times newsroom. They needed to be in Fox's newsroom. They needed to be on the Supreme Court. They needed to be working in Congress. Because if they don't, their voices aren't heard. So if we want to talk about a division, if the people who are running this country, the kind of power elite, as it were, are all just urban meritocrats, that's a problem. That's not the story of America. That's the story of 5% of America,
Yeah. And I want to come back to that, because the other thing you note, I think, is that what we might term the cultural elites, or I think you do use that term, or certainly coastal elites, I think is how you term it. They tend to look down on rural America, but it doesn't go transitively the other way.
Not at all. I mean, actually, that's a really good point. One of the things that really resonated with me was the folks I talked to had no problem with progressive politics. And, I don't think that everyone who votes for Trump is like trying to stick it to the woke agenda. In fact, I'm sure they're not. I think what they don't want is to be told that they have to care about the same things that the coastal elites care about. And they don't want to be told that they're bad people because they care more about their church and their family than they do about issues that a lot of people in cities are passionate about. They're just different. The problem has been, and I think the media has played a huge role in this, is that we've taken differences and said, well, they're divides, rather than we just prioritize things slightly differently. And we're normalizing that and creating a value when it's just a matter of fact.
Yeah. So, and this is why I think your book is filling a very important void at a very important time. I hope it actually comes out at some point.
It's supposed to.
It's supposed to.
Publicity takes a long time.
Yes. But you mentioned that some of these people need to be out front talking about these issues. And we do have someone running for, I promised you I wouldn't get too political, but you mentioned in the book J.D. Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegy. And it really is about Appalachian. Could you just talk? He is the voice in some ways for rural America, and how does that relate to what you're doing, and is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I read J.D. Vance's book. Nothing had ever been written like it before, and so it stuck with me. I actually have taught it to my master's students and my doctoral students, and they hate it. They don't like it. I've stopped teaching it because they believe that even though it is a insider's view, it is utterly unsympathetic to the structural issues that folks in Appalachia face. And yeah, he's clearly really smart, and he got himself to Yale, and he's entrepreneurial and creative, and I don't agree with his politics, but you got to give him that. Here's the thing, though, he's the unique one. And to sort of say, well, there's this cultural issue where these people, they expect a lot, and then they don't blame themselves for things. It's like they have a really hard life. And Appalachia isn't, rural Pennsylvania or rural Texas, so it's really important to not sort of blanket and say this is the story of rural America. But Appalachia and parts of the South, they are on the back foot, and I just don't think you can give people a hard time for the fact that they don't pull themselves. We don't do enough for them. We ignore these parts of the country, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think your book is very persuasive in that regard. And just to reemphasize, what you show is that there are areas that are prospering and some areas that are struggling. And he focused on the areas that struggle. And if we shine our light on the difficulties, we're going to result in different policy implications than if we draw lessons from the successes. I do think it is a little unfortunate because there may be some successes in some of these areas that we could actually learn from.
Totally.
Like, for example, on affordable housing.
Yeah.
That would be an interesting example.
Well, and Dana, just to kind of talk a little more about Vance's approach. So I spoke about Vance's book to a number of the people I interviewed in Appalachia. And there was this lovely man, Clay, who lived in the foothills, and he was a poet. And he just said...
We can call him a hippie.
He was probably a hippie. But he was really thoughtful, and he just said, you don't need to eulogize us yet, And he had this whole different lens on the world, which was like, yes, we're poor, but we have community, we have a life. Like, don't just dismiss us because we're poor, And his life was hard. I mean, I have this whole thing in my book about how hard it is for him to get to a grocery store. I mean, we talk about urban food deserts. I mean, it is like next level when you live in that part of Appalachia. To get a fresh vegetable, it's like a 2-hour drive. So but I think his point was like, that's just not our whole story. We're not one-dimensional.
Mm-hmm. And this gets, again, at this issue, the quality, how it appears to me, at least from reading the book, that how they value quality of life and how they think about what gives their life purpose is different. And you mentioned religion. You brought up religion. I do think, we talked about education. And I want to press you on that, too, because gently, which is your point is a college degree may not be for everybody.
Yeah.
And you make the point in the book that only a third of Americans have them anyway.
Yeah.
And again, if these prestigious institutions, which are only what you said, 0.5%, are we really defining what's success around that? That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, also I think, and this gets into the conversation around the meritocracy in general, like, if you live in the bubble of highly educated, upwardly mobile people, there is an expectation that all of those children go to university. And I think the same applies for them. Like, they may not want to do that either. And yet there is this idea that that's just their track. So my dream is like the kid in West Virginia who does want to be the bioscientist, he gets to go to Yale. And then that girl who grew up in the Palisades who actually likes to work with things gets to be a carpenter. But we don't have those choices right now,
Yep, that's right. You've noted that liberals and conservatives tend to caricature each other. Mm-hmm. To what degree does that widen the political divide, and how might we counter it?
Well, I think what we end up doing is, we look at a MAGA hat and we just assume everything about that person. And we assume everything about them vis-a-vis their politics. And I'm borrowing from Arlie Hochschild. She wrote a brilliant book called Strangers in Their Own Land about the Tea Party in Louisiana. And she found that she went into the heart of the bayou and she interviewed all these folks, and she didn't understand why they were supporting what became the Tea Party, given that these were the very folks who were dismantling the EPA, and they lived in one of the most polluted states. And she's like, what's going on here? And she finds it's about culture. But I sort of digress there, because the thing I'm going to say is she wrote this great review of Deaton and Case's book, Deaths of Despair. And she has this beautiful phrase where she says, we look at the MAGA hat and we don't like them. But what if the man in the MAGA hat has the son with lung cancer, or he lost his job to the coal mine? We care about that, but immediately we stop caring when we see the MAGA hat. And we look at the Berkeley sweatshirt or the NPR bumper sticker, and the right will do the same. And so I think the point is that these superficial trappings make us lose sight of some of the other very important things that are going on with us as people. These are a few really interesting stats. Like, first of all, urban, rural, everyone has the same view of democracy. They really believe in it. Everyone is super despondent about, faith in the government. I mean, half of people have hardly any faith in the legislative branch. I don't remember what the percentage was, the Supreme Court. I imagine it's gone down a little more. But you realize there's so much similarities on what it feels like to be American, what it feels like to be American in the 21st century. And so that should transcend some of these kind of superficial cultural moments that we're in.
Mm-hmm. But there are some issues, like the role of religion in America and things like that, where I think there probably are serious differences. But I think one of the points you're making is that fundamentally, people are, if anything, they respect that other people hold other views, and we have a process by which we arbitrate that, and that's called democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting. One of the folks I talked to was a farmer in Iowa named Greg, and he was a lovely guy. And I asked him about his feelings on marriage equality, and he said, I struggle with it religiously, but I feel people have a right to do what they want to do with their lives. But it doesn't align completely with my view of the Bible. But he did not in that space say he was against it. He was clearly not homophobic. And I remember in that same conversation, he said this thing that I had never really thought about it like this. He referenced the Supreme Court case around the bakery that wouldn't bake the cake for the gay couple. And, as a liberal myself, I just thought that was totally wrong. But he said this thing, and he said, I don't know. I think if someone didn't want to bake me a cake, I wouldn't want them to bake me a cake. I want someone who wants to bake me a cake for my wedding to bake my cake. And I thought, you know what? I was so just strident in my liberal progressive view that that was just wrong, that I didn't even realize Craig's kind of got a point. Do I want that person to make my cake? No, thank you. I'll take it to a baker that will and be happy to do so. So I think that is important to realize that there is this idea of openness to difference that is more there than we realize. And I think the media does a disservice in characterizing people.
Yeah, in some ways they don't just have cultural capital, they have common sense.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
I don't know if there's a metric for that, but it seems to make sense. If you were advising a Democratic candidate, because we know there tend to be voting differences, what would you tell them if they wanted to reach out across this divide?
I would tell them to stop moralizing. I mean, no one wants to be on the receiving end of sanctimony. They don't want other people's snobbery. They want to feel like they belong. And we see this time and time again, that people are not rational in some sort of, no offense, economist view of the world, that my taxes will be, or my social services will be better if I vote Democratic. They say, the Republicans seem to understand me. In the same way that limousine liberals, as we used to call them, vote Democratic, even if economically it would be better to vote Republican. Why? Because culture does embody so much of who we are, and when we feel left out or looked down upon, we don't want anything to do with that. We didn't like it in elementary school. We don't like it as voting adults. So I would tell Democrats to stop that.
So maybe don't call people deplorable?
That would be a good step one.
What about on the Republican side?
They need to, and I can't mince my words here, they need to ditch the far right. It is doing nothing but disservice to their agenda. There are a lot of super moderate, decent Republicans, and they do not agree with the far right. They do not relate to the things that are going on the far right. And they need politicians who will speak up and just be, the Mitt Romneys of the world, just decent Republicans doing their thing,
They seem to be being chased out of the party, though.
Yep.
So, we've seen that time and again. So, okay, I want to get to some audience questions. But before we do that, are there any words of hope you can offer Americans?
Yeah, I'm going to start wonky and then I'll get down to the personal. So Gordon Allport, he had this theory of contact hypothesis, which was that people had a lot of stereotypes and resistance to other people because they didn't get close to them. But when you spent time with people, you found a lot of commonalities. They didn't have to be just like you. You just were like, oh, you're a nice person, or we can laugh about this. And I think that our social media and just frankly, the geography of the United States has created this vacuum for all of us to live in. And my hope is that if we actually spent any time at all talking to people, and I mean in even the most quotidian way, like you're on an airplane with someone and you're having to visit your aunt who lives in Arkansas or whatever, that you spend a moment talking to them and understanding them as people, because that is actually how we're going to heal this country.
I just want to qualify that. It is extremely dangerous to start a conversation at the beginning of a flight with the passenger next to you. And from experience, I would tread lightly in that, especially if it's transcontinental. And we'll just leave it at that.
Touche.
Yeah. If you could escape, then
maybe start the conversation like as you're landing.
Yeah, exactly.
Sound good?
And then you can go to the airport bar afterwards.
Totally. Or honestly, take a moment. I'm a diehard New York Times Pod Save America person. I get on Fox News a few times a week. I think it's so important to hear how other people are thinking about these things. I don't have to agree. Often I don't, but it's good to know.
Yeah, and actually, one thing, because I do that as a regular, it's part of my job, really. And they're talking about different issues, too. Yeah. They're not talking about this. You hear a lot about January 6th and the future of democracy on some channels, and you hear a lot about immigration on other channels.
That's right.
And, the thing is, your point is, we really need to find ways to communicate about these with others. And, someone asked this question. I think you kind of got to it, but I want to repeat it again. With the social media and algorithms, it's increasingly difficult for liberals and conservatives to talk to each other and share information with each other. How do we break through? But I'm going to take out the option that we're going to send them all on transcontinental flights together by political persuasion.
Our first point of disagreement. I think you need to make an effort to understand someone else. This is going to sound a little hokey, but think about how we are with our friends and our kids. You take the time to understand why they are feeling the way they are. And I think our way that we can do that on a macro level with others is by bothering to listen. And without this kind of idea that like you're going to immediately make fun of it or deride it or disagree, just like, I wonder why they think that. Like I really think if that was like a frame, we would actually at least appreciate where other people are coming from.
Yes. So that's related to this specific question, which is, in your interviews, did you find a broad range of views on sanctity of life? I'm thinking of your comment that the guy in Iowa said people should do what they want. How did he feel about reproductive choice? This is obviously a flashpoint issue for many Americans right now.
I actually didn't ask folks about their position on abortion and Roe v. Wade. I did a lot of these interviews before the Supreme Court decision. Although what I will say is that the Pew research on this shows that something like 85% of Americans support some or all right to choose. So again, this is this point that it's not a Republican issue. It's a recent Supreme Court ruling that most Americans don't agree with. I think that's the way to really interpret that.
Well, many, Roe was in some ways status quo consensus between two extreme views on either side. And we got rid of that court-imposed middle ground, and now the sand is shifting, and it's not clear. Some Democrats in battleground states are having to move away from these issues as quickly as people like Blake Edwards, I think, in Arizona, and others who've been very strident on this as well. So it's on both sides.
Absolutely.
And this gets to your point that a lot of Americans are in the middle.
Yeah.
And they have very ambivalent feelings towards very broad things like take away all guns or give everyone assault weapons. Those are very extreme views, and many Americans are kind of in the middle on them.
Well, a vast majority of Americans do support stricter gun laws.
Yeah, exactly.
Red flag laws, issues around mental health and acquiring a gun. This is, again, that we're dealing with 70, 80% of Americans. That's a lot of people on the same page.
Yep. And I think that's an important point as we come to the election season. Some people are single issue voters. They're very strident, and people will talk to it, and it affects, they lobby for things, and you see this in legislation. But when you start, your book is about the views and the cultural divides. And when you talk to, not about the politics necessarily of these things. And when there is a lot more consensus between these communities than people might realize.
There is. I think the other thing that we have to realize is, this is very germane to the midterms. I think we ascribe too much of an emotional value to everyone's vote. There was an emotional value to my vote when I voted for Obama and for Hillary Clinton. And with Biden, I'm a Democrat. I voted for President Biden. I actually think he's doing a pretty decent job. That's my own personal opinion. But my point is, that's a wide array of emotions that I have about my vote, ranging from really excited to not at all. And I think then we see all this come in and we go, oh my gosh, rural America, they just love Trump. It's like, rural America has been going conservative for decades now, and they voted for the Republican candidate. So I just think it's important to not extract too much from numbers without actually understanding the people behind it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And as someone who's taken an interest and studied politics and policy my entire life, to think that you would be fully consistent with one party's view on everything, if you're someone who believes in evidence, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And, even looking at the Trump administration, we just had someone in talking about Operation Warp Speed, which was the effort to develop vaccines, which took a process that usually takes 10 years and brought it down to about 12 months and saved millions of lives. That's a huge success. Maybe one of the most impactful social programs we've seen in decades. And, that happened in an administration where crazy things were going on. And so, but that policy was right, and actually you hear this on both sides of the aisle, actually. And I do know that when I go to Washington, people are always like, I think you're a Democrat, I think you're a Republican. And I say, no, I'm an independent. But I figured since you had revealed your voting, I should at least...
You're going to come clean?
come clean with my party affiliation. Anyway, we're running out of time. So any last words that you'd like to share with the audience?
I think probably, to be honest with you, the most important thing I think that I learned with my book was to understand that life is complicated, people's decision making is complicated, and we have to be more open-minded to why people do what they do and have the values that they do, because we want them to do the same for us. And I think, I was reminded, Ross Douthat was writing in the New York Times a few weeks ago, and I think we might have exchanged an email about this. His point was, to Floridians, California looks insane, and to Californians, Florida looks insane. There's something in between the two. And, to appreciate that and to still be able to have a coffee with someone or say hi to them, I think is an enormous thing. That's what America's always been about. So it's really sad to me that we've become so petty and divisive when there is this really important shared cultural experience of being here and the experiment that we remain.
That's right. And some people think we choose where to locate based on those views. I think it really has to do with whether you dislike hurricanes or earthquakes.
Certainly with those two states.
Anyway, I want to thank you. And I just want to say, when this book comes out, I urge everyone, because of the partisan times that we live in. This will give you a perspective on a side of America that we usually don't see, and I want to thank you for using your platform at the Price School to talk about this. So,
thank you, Dana.
Thank you. And that's it from our worldwide studios. So take care. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you.
Everyone.